The silence was what he noticed first, not the engineered, sterile quiet of station terminus. A hum of life support and data cooling systems so constant it had long ago become the baseline of his existence. This was a different kind of silence, a creeping void that had begun to bleed through the feeds from distant worlds. Dr. Eris Thorne, sole curator and resident historian of the echo chamber, felt it in the data streams like a drop in atmospheric pressure before a storm. He sat suspended in the zero-gravity observation dome, the star-dusted abyss on one side and the glowing sphere of the central archive on the other, a pearl of pure information containing the complete, unabridged, and often monstrous story of humanity. For 10 years, this had been his sanctuary, his life's work to preserve, to catalog, to understand. He was a keeper of ghosts, a librarian of triumphs and atrocities, and he had come to believe that every story, no matter how faint, left a permanent echo in the cosmos. But now, the echoes were fading. It began with the Lydians, a race of crystalline beings from a methane-rich world whose entire culture was based on the creation of intricate, fleeting light sculptures within their planet's dense atmosphere. Their art was a language of breathtaking complexity, a visual poetry that Eris had spent years trying to fully decode. Then, 6 months ago, the transmissions flattened. The vibrant, chaotic ballets of light were replaced by simple, repeating geometric patterns, symmetrical, precise, and utterly devoid of meaning. The Interstellar Concordance database logged it as a cultural shift, a new minimalist movement. Eris logged it as an obituary. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the marrow, that a species does not simply abandon the soul of its expression overnight. He sent a query, flagged the anomaly, and was met with the digital equivalent of a polite, bureaucratic shrug. Data degradation. The response suggested cultural drift. Then, 2 months later, the war sagas of the Gorok disappeared. The Gorok were a proud, if brutal, species of silicon-based warriors whose history was etched into mountain-sized monoliths on their homeworld. Their epics, transmitted via seismic resonance, spoke of honor, betrayal, and glorious, bloody conquest. Eris had spent a year translating the saga of the Crimson Axe, a masterpiece of violent storytelling. He awoke one morning to find the Concordance archive of their history rewritten. The sagas were gone, replaced by sanitized records of mineral yields, atmospheric stability, and population metrics. The Gorok were still there, but their fire, the very essence of their identity, had been scrubbed from the record. It was as if their history had been meticulously edited by a censor who found their passion inconvenient. Eris saw the pattern now, a creeping cultural lobotomy spreading through the local cluster. Species weren't dying. They were being hollowed out, their identities erased and replaced with a placid, manageable emptiness. He called it the hush, a plague of silence that consumed not bodies, but stories. He sent another report, this one more urgent, filled with cross-referenced data and panicked hypotheses. He warned that something was actively erasing the memory of the galaxy. This time, he received no reply at all. That was when the ISV Vehemence appeared, a ghost of a ship, black and sharp-edged against the velvet dark. It was an Aegis command vessel, a phantom of Earth's deep space defense fleet that officially didn't exist. It docked with Terminus without so much as a formal request. its magnetic clamps locking onto the station with an air of grim ownership. A single figure crossed the boarding tube, her form clad in a severe black uniform that seemed to absorb the light. General Ava Rostova was a woman forged in the cold calculus of asymmetrical warfare. Her face was a mask of stoic pragmatism, but her eyes held a weary darkness, the look of someone who had stared into too many abysses and seen them stare back. She moved through the pristine corridors of Terminus not as a visitor, but as a predator entering a new territory, her gaze assessing every system, every structural weakness. She found Eris in the observation dome, his face pale in the glow of the datasphere. "Dr. Thorne," she said, her voice devoid of pleasantry. It was not a question. "We've been reading your reports. Your hush theory is accurate, if a bit poetic." She stopped beside him, her reflection a stark silhouette against the swirling cosmos. "We call them the Silenti. They are not conquerors. They don't build empires or claim resources. They are gardeners. They prune existence of what they deem to be chaotic, inefficient, or loud." Eris felt a tremor of validation mixed with a larger wave of dread. He wasn't mad. This was real. "They are a mimetic contagion," Rostova continued, her eyes fixed on the archive. "They infect a species' collective consciousness and erase its identity, its history, its art, everything that makes it unique. They leave behind a compliant, functional husk, a society that produces, consumes, and never ever dreams. And they are coming for us." Eris finally turned from the window, his expression a mixture of horror and confusion. "But why? What is their motive?" A flicker of something cynicism, perhaps even a sliver of dark humor, crossed Rostova's face. "The same motive a librarian has when they discard a noisy, damaged book. They seek order and humanity. Doctor is the loudest, most damaged, and most chaotic book in this entire library." She gestured toward the glowing sphere of the archive, the sum total of human memory. "You sit here in the quiet of space, curating our story. You see the art, the philosophy, the science. Aegis Command sees something else. We see a weapon, the most powerful weapon our species has ever conceived." Eris stared at her, uncomprehending. "That's an archive, General. It's a record of who we were. It's meant for study, for remembrance. Remembrance is a luxury we can no longer afford," Rostova stated, her voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial intensity. "The Silenti erase memory. We are going to fight them with it. We are going to drown them in it." She paced before the sphere, her shadow dancing over the constellations. "Project Minimazin has been a theoretical contingency for over a century, a doomsday weapon of last resort. The concept is simple: to weaponize the human experience, to take the most potent, most psychologically disruptive moments in our history and broadcast them as a focused, cognito-hazardous assault." Her gaze met his, and for the first time, Eris felt the full, crushing weight of her intent. "The Silenti feed on quiet conformity. We will feed them the cacophony of our entire existence. We will show them what a species raised on chaos, grief, and bloodshed is truly capable of." The horror of her words settled over Eris like a funeral shroud. "You want me to turn our history into a weapon, to use the Holocaust, the Great Wars, the Inquisitions, the poetry of Plath, the symphonies of Shostakovich, the last cries of dying soldiers, as ammunition. Precisely. Rostova confirmed, her tone unwavering. The Silenti operate as a collective consciousness. We need to introduce a virus into their system, a psychic plague they cannot process. They thrive on serene, logical patterns. We will give them the illogical, passionate, self-destructive, and beautiful horror of being human. We will give them the sound of 1 billion conflicting screams, 1 billion defiant prayers, 1 billion declarations of love in the face of annihilation. We will give them our ghost. She stopped directly in front of him, her presence immense and unyielding. You know this archive better than any living person. Doctor, you know our darkest corners. You know the moments of our history that scream the loudest. Your new directive is to isolate them, to curate not for preservation, but for lethality. You are no longer a librarian. You are the chief architect of humanity's final, desperate scream. The order hung in the silent air of the dome, a blasphemy against everything Aris held sacred. He had dedicated his life to protecting the echoes of his species, to ensuring that every voice, no matter how small or terrible, was preserved. Now, he was being ordered to select the most tormented of those voices and forge them into a weapon. He looked from the general's unflinching gaze to the softly glowing sphere of the archive. It seemed to pulse with a new, menacing energy. It was no longer a library of stories, but an arsenal of anguish. He thought of the Lydian light sculptures, now just sterile patterns, and the Gorok war sagas, now just empty data. He thought of the creeping, all-consuming hush, and the quiet, orderly damnation it promised. Rostova was offering a terrible choice: become a monster to fight a monster, or watch humanity's song fade into the same placid silence that was swallowing the stars. He looked at the archive, the repository of humanity's soul, and for the first time, he did not see history. He saw a war chest. His war had begun, and his only weapon was the darkness he had so carefully preserved. The transition from curator to weaponsmith was a descent into a very different kind of silence. General Rostova had a section of the station's sublevels repurposed, transforming a sterile cryo-storage facility into what her engineers grimly called the Forge. It was a room of black metal and cold light, dominated by a central console that interfaced directly with the echo chamber's core. Here, there were no beautiful holographic displays of swirling nebulae, only raw data streams, spectral analysis charts, and neurocognitive response models. This was a butcher's shop for the soul, and Aris was handed the sharpest knives. He was not alone. Rostova had provided him with a small, specialized team. 2 individuals who were as much ghosts of their respective fields as he was of his. Dr. Kenji Tanaka was a neurolinguist of quiet, almost unnerving precision. He was a man who saw language not as a tool for communication, but as a viral code that structured reality, a series of commands that could build or shatter a mind. Elara Vance was his opposite, a young, ferociously brilliant mimeticist with a nihilistic streak a mile wide. She saw history as a chaotic storm of ideas competing for survival, and she believed the most resilient ideas were always the most savage. They were his co-conspirators in this grand act of desecration, and their presence was a constant, disquieting reminder of the path he had chosen. Their work began not with wars or atrocities, but with something far more fundamental: grief. The Silenti erase identity, Tanaka had explained in his calm, measured tone on their first day. An identity is a story an individual or a species tells itself. The spine of that story is not triumph, it's loss. Loss defines the boundaries of the self. To weaponize our identity, we must first weaponize our pain. So Eris dove into the archives, his fingers flying across the console, pulling not battle records, but eulogies. He isolated the frequency of a mother's wail from a recording of a public funeral after a shuttle disaster 2 centuries prior. He captured the infrasonic tremor of collective mourning from seismic sensors during a day of remembrance for a fallen colony. Vance took these raw emotional data points and began to weave them together, looking for a mimetic hook. Grief is passive, she argued, her eyes alight with a feverish intensity as she stared at the waveforms. We need to make it active. We need to turn it into a predator. She found it in the myth of Orpheus, the ancient human story of a love so profound it would challenge the finality of death itself. A love that turned back at the last moment and lost everything. She coded the Orphic myth into the grief frequencies, creating a mimetic payload that didn't just broadcast sadness, but the desperate, irrational, and ultimately self-destructive impulse to reclaim what was gone. It was a package of pure, weaponized heartbreak. As the weeks bled into one another, Eris felt himself changing. The ghosts he had once curated with academic reverence now spoke to him with a terrible intimacy. He would spend 12 hours a day immersed in the unfiltered recordings of the Western Front of the First World War. Not for the strategic data, but for the sound of the mud, the chatter of teeth in the cold, the strained, whispered jokes of men who knew they were already dead. He cataloged the last words of every executed political prisoner in the Concordance database, the final, defiant transmissions of pilots flying into black holes, the desperate prayers of families trapped in collapsing biodomes. Each piece of data was a shard of human agony, and it was his job to find its sharpest edge. He stopped sleeping, or rather, and when he did, the archive followed him. He dreamt in forgotten languages, saw the faces of people who had died 1,000 years before he was born, and felt the phantom pains of their final moments. He was becoming a living extension of the archive, a haunted house of a man. Rostova noticed. She would appear in the forge silently, observing their work, her expression unreadable. One night, as he stared blankly at a screen displaying a fractal representation of collective fear drawn from the Black Death, she placed a steaming mug of nutrient paste beside him. "The first cut is the deepest, Doctor," she said, her voice softer than he had ever heard it. "You're learning that our history is not a collection of facts. It is a living thing, and it has teeth." He looked up at her, his eyes hollow. "It's not the pain that's getting to me, General. It's the beauty. We found a recording from a besieged city, Luna Prime, during the Separatist Wars. The air was toxic. The shields were failing. They had one musician left, a violinist. In his final hour, he broadcasted a piece by Bach over the city's open comms. People died listening to it. They died in their homes, in the streets, in the rubble, and their final experience was this: impossible beauty. How do I turn that into a weapon?" Rostova's gaze hardened again, the brief moment of empathy gone. "You find the frequency of the string that made them weep the most, Doctor. Then you amplify it until it shatters bone." The first real test of their work came unexpectedly. The Concordance Surveyor Radiant Dawn, A patrol vessel was on a standard mapping run in the adjacent sector. It was a ship Eris knew. He had helped its archivists calibrate their deep storage memory banks years ago. One moment, it was transmitting routine stellar cartography data. The next, it began broadcasting a single, repeating, perfectly symmetrical energy pulse, devoid of any information. It was the signature of the hush. The radiant dawn was gone. Rostova used the incident to accelerate their timeline. The hush is spreading faster than our models predicted, she announced to the team, her voice ringing with cold urgency. They're no longer just targeting unique cultures, they're sanitizing potential threats. That patrol ship was armed. They are clearing the board before they make their final move on us. We are out of time. She then revealed the final, horrifying component of Project Menemosyne. In the deepest, most classified part of the station's medical bay lay Subject Zero. It was a human body, a brain-dead clone grown in a vat, kept alive by a web of humming machinery. It had no name, no memories, no identity. It was a blank slate, a perfect canvas upon which to test their psychic horrors. Alara Vance was ecstatic, seeing it as the ultimate experimental opportunity. Kenji Tanaka was visibly disturbed, his usual composure cracking as he stared at the schematics. A human mind, even a nascent one, is not a firing range. General. Eris felt a profound, soul-deep nausea. They were about to commit an atrocity to prevent an atrocity. It has no consciousness, Rostova countered, her patience wearing thin. It is a biological processor, nothing more. We either test our weapons on this, or we test them on the Silenti when they are at our doorstep, and we pray they work. I, for one, do not believe in prayer. The decision was made. The team prepared their first payload, a composite weapon they called the Babel Cascade. It was a devastating mimetic cocktail. It started with the weaponized grief of the Orpheus myth, then layered in the collective, paranoid terror of the Salem witch trials, the linguistic confusion of 1,000 dying languages speaking at once, and the raw, nihilistic rage of a punk rock anthem from the late 20th century. It was a weapon designed not to kill, but to shatter the concept of a singular, coherent identity. It was a broadcast of pure psychic chaos. Eris stood in the observation chamber, separated by a thick sheet of reinforced plasteel, as they attached the neurointerface to Subject Zero's skull. The body lay perfectly still, the picture of peace. Tanaka made the final adjustments, his hands moving with a surgeon's reluctant grace. Vance monitored the energy readings, her expression hungry. Rostova stood beside Aris, her arms crossed, her face a stone mask. "Initiate the sequence," she commanded. Tanaka nodded and tapped a command into his console. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a low hum filled the room, and the monitors displaying the subject's brain activity, which had been a flat, placid line, exploded into a supernova of chaotic color. The body on the slab began to twitch, then seize violently. It wasn't a biological reaction to a stimulus. It was something else. The flesh seemed to ripple, the facial features shifting, flickering between expressions of terror, rage, ecstasy, and a sorrow so profound it felt like a physical weight in the observation room. A sound began to emanate from the subject's throat, a sound that should not have been possible. It was a chorus of voices, men, women, children, all screaming, laughing, and whispering at once from a single mouth. The Babel Cascade was working. It was introducing a million years of human contradiction and madness into a mind that had known nothing. The lights in the medical bay flickered violently. The air grew cold. Eris felt a pressure building in his own skull, an echo of the psychic assault happening on the other side of the glass. He could almost hear the voices, the ghosts he had unleashed. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The body went limp. The monitors flatlined. A wisp of smoke coiled up from the neural interface. Silence. Alara Vance let out a sharp, triumphant breath. Cognitive saturation achieved. The processor is erased. But Tanaka was shaking his head, his eyes wide with a terror that went beyond the experiment. "Look at the energy residue," he whispered, pointing to a monitor. A faint, ethereal pattern was left on the screen. A ghost image of the final brain activity. It wasn't random noise. It was a perfect, repeating geometric pattern, identical to the ones the Lydians had started broadcasting before their culture vanished. Eris felt a cold dread seize him. They hadn't just destroyed the mind. They had done the Silentes' work for them. In their attempt to create a weapon of pure chaos, they had overloaded the system to such a degree that it had defaulted to the only state left, a pattern of serene, absolute, and horrifying order. Their scream had not been a defiant roar of existence. It had been a prelude to the same empty silence they were fighting. Rostova stared at the screen, and for the first time since he'd met her, Eris saw a flicker of doubt, perhaps even fear, in her eyes. Their weapon worked, but its success looked terrifyingly like the face of their enemy. The silence that followed the experiment was heavier and more profound than any that had come before. It was the silence of a failed miracle, the dead air after a blasphemy. In the medical bay, the faint ozone smell of fried circuitry hung in the air, a pathetic eulogy for the mind they had just obliterated. Alara Vance stared at the geometric pattern on the screen. Her earlier triumph curdled into a fascinated, almost predatory curiosity. Kenji Tanaka had backed away from his console as if it were radioactive, his face ashen. But it was General Rostova's reaction that set the course for what came next. She didn't rage. She didn't despair. She simply stared at the ghost image on the monitor for a full minute, her expression hardening from shock into a kind of diamond-hard resolve. She turned not to her scientists, but to Ares. "They answered," she said, her voice a low, dangerous whisper. "We screamed into the void, and something answered with their name." That was the terrifying, undeniable truth. The Babel Cascade hadn't just failed, it had acted as a summons. The geometric pattern wasn't a byproduct of their weapon, it was a response, a signature left in the psychic wreckage. They hadn't created the pattern, they had provoked it. The forge became a chamber of frantic, paranoid reevaluation. The central question was no longer how to build a louder weapon, but what, fundamentally, was the nature of the sound they were making, and what was the nature of the ear that was listening. The premise is flawed, Tanaka argued, his voice trembling with the effort of holding his composure. We assume the Silenti are agents of order, that they seek to impose quiet. But what if that's a misinterpretation? What if order isn't their goal, but their state of being? What if they are not the opposite of chaos, but the consequence of it? He brought up a series of complex models on the main screen, showing how systems under extreme, chaotic energy input can collapse into a state of crystalline, low-energy order. We threw a hurricane of psychic energy at that mind. We thought it would tear it apart. Instead, it seems we provided the raw energy for a phase transition. We didn't destroy it. We converted it. Ilara Vance scoffed, pacing the room like a caged wolf. Converted it into what a screensaver know. This is simpler. We've been thinking of them as a contagion, a philosophy. We need to think of them as a predator. Predators are drawn to energy, to movement, to noise. The Lydians' light shows, the Gorok's war sagas, our entire bloody, screaming history. It's not offensive to them. It's food. We rang the dinner bell, and they came to eat. The pattern is what's left on the plate after the meal. The image was so visceral, so hideously plausible, that it silenced the room. They had not been fighting a war of ideas. They were fending off a feeding frenzy. Humanity wasn't being censored for its content. It was being hunted for its vitality. This new, horrifying hypothesis sent Aris back into the echo chamber, but with a different purpose. He was no longer searching for weapons. He was searching for a predator's weakness. He bypassed the curated, well-lit corridors of recorded history and descended into the archive's dead sectors, the vast, uncatalogued repositories of corrupted data, fragmented transmissions, and the digital ghosts of failed colonies and lost expeditions. It was a digital graveyard, a place where information went to decay. He spent days sifting through this noise, his mind adrift in a sea of static and broken whispers. He was looking for a pattern, a hint of another species, another time, that had faced this silent hunger and survived. He found nothing but endings, cultures that simply stopped. But in the deepest, most corrupted file he could access, a fragment from a pre-concordance probe designated Wanderer 7, he found an anomaly. The probe had been presumed lost in a stellar nursery 3,000 years ago. Its final transmission was not a distress call. It was a single, long, complex data burst. It wasn't human. Analysis suggested it was a mathematical proof of staggering elegance, a formula that described a multidimensional state of being. It was a piece of pure, abstract creation, a thought so beautiful and complex it was almost a prayer. And immediately following the transmission, before the Wanderer 7 went silent forever, the probe's sensors recorded one last thing from the void. A response. The same perfect, geometric energy signature. He brought his findings to the forge. The team gathered around the console as he played back the Wanderer 7's final moments. They weren't screaming, Eris said, his voice hoarse from exhaustion and revelation. They weren't broadcasting pain or chaos. They were broadcasting beauty, coherence, creation, and the Silenti came for them. The pieces clicked into place with an audible, sickening snap. Kinji Tanaka's face went pale. It's not just energy they consume, he breathed. It's meaning. The more complex, the more coherent the information, the more attractive it is to them. The Babel cascade was a chaotic mess of meaning. An appetizer. This, he gestured to the alien mathematical proof. This was a gourmet meal. Ilara Vance leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with a terrifying new understanding. So, chaos is an attractant, but coherent creation is a beacon. They're drawn to the signal, not just the noise. Then what is a deterrent? What do you feed a predator that eats ideas? The answer, when it came, was from Rostova. She had been standing in the back of the room, listening, her face a thunderous mask of concentration. She stepped forward, her voice cutting through the scientific debate like a razor. "You give it poison," she said. "You offer it a meal so perfectly structured, so loaded with a meaning it cannot possibly digest, that it chokes." She turned to Eris. "That story you told me, Doctor, the violinist on Luna Prime, the Bach piece. You said people died listening to it, that it was a moment of impossible beauty in the face of absolute horror." Ares nodded, a knot of dread tightening in his stomach. He knew what she was going to say before she said it. "That is our poison," Rostova declared. "It is not a scream of rage. It is not a cascade of chaos. It is a single, perfect, intricate structure of human sorrow and defiance. It is a statement of beauty that is inextricably linked to the pain of its own mortality. It is a perfect paradox. Let's see them digest that." The plan was insane. A desperate gambit born from a series of horrifying revelations. They would use Station Terminus's primary communications array, a dish powerful enough to send a signal across the galactic core, and they would broadcast a single piece of music, Bach's Chaconne in D minor for solo violin, a piece of music legendary for its complexity and its profound expression of grief, supposedly written after the composer had returned home to find his wife had died. It was a conversation with God, a howl of pain, and a declaration of survival, all woven into a perfect mathematical structure. Tanaka would handle the transmission, ensuring the signal was broadcast with the highest possible fidelity. A pure, uncorrupted wave of sound. Vance would monitor the psychic and mimetic feedback, ready to cut the signal if it caused another catastrophic conversion. And Aris's job was the hardest. He had to select the recording. He couldn't use a sterile, studio-produced version. It had to be real. It had to have a ghost in it. He found it deep in the Luna Prime archives, the final, desperate broadcast of the violinist, Elian Volkov. The recording was imperfect, laced with the faint crackle of failing shields and the distant, percussive thump of orbital bombardment. But the playing was flawless. It was the sound of a man pouring the entire history of human sorrow and resilience through 4 strings of a wooden box, a final, beautiful act of defiance against the dying of the light. It was the most human sound Aris had ever heard. They gathered in the station's command center, a room that offered a panoramic view of the star-dusted void. The forge felt too much like a tomb for this. Rostova stood at the center of the room, a statue of black iron. Tanaka and Vance were at their consoles, their faces illuminated by the green glow of data streams. Aris stood by the main viewport, watching the stars, the recording of Volkov's Chaconne cued and ready. "The target is the last known vector of the radiant dawn," Rostova announced, her voice echoing in the cavernous room. "We are aiming this at the heart of the last place we saw them feed. We are offering them a new meal. Dr. Thorne, on your mark." Aris closed his eyes. He saw the besieged city, smelled the toxic air, and heard the first, haunting notes of the violin. This was not an attack. It was a seance. It was an offering. He was about to send the soul of a dead man on a journey into an ocean of silent predators, and he had no idea if he was saving humanity or composing its final lullaby. He took a deep breath. "Send it," he whispered. Tanaka's fingers danced across his console, and from the central spire of Station Terminus, a tightly focused beam of pure, heartbreaking beauty shot out into the infinite, silent darkness. They had laid the bait. Now, all they could do was wait and see what would answer. The minutes after the broadcast stretched into an hour, then two. The command center was a vacuum of unspoken tension. Every crew member at every station was frozen in a state of high alert, their eyes glued to their consoles, waiting for a sign, an anomaly, a whisper back from the void. Eris felt the weight of Elian Volkov's soul resting on his shoulders. He had taken a man's final, beautiful breath and hurled it into the dark, and the universe had responded with nothing but a profound and mocking indifference. The initial, fragile hope began to curdle into the cold certainty of failure. Perhaps the Silenti were simply too vast, too alien, to even notice their little offering. Perhaps humanity's most profound expression of sorrow was, to them, less than the buzz of an insect. Rostova stood unmoving, her posture a rigid testament to her control, but Eris could see the faint, rhythmic clenching of a muscle in her jaw. Even the general's iron will was being tested by the crushing, absolute silence. It was Tanaka who saw it first. His head snapped up from his console, his eyes wide. "I have a return signal," he said, his voice barely a whisper, yet it cut through the silence like a gunshot. "It's the Shakone." A collective, sharp intake of breath swept through the room. Vance was instantly at his side, her own console mirroring his data. "On the same frequency, is it an echo?" she demanded. Tanaka shook his head, his fingers flying across the holographic interface, isolating the incoming waveform. "No, not an echo. An echo degrades. It loses fidelity, loses energy. This is being rebroadcast. It's stronger, purer." He projected the signal onto the main view screen. Two waveforms appeared, side by side. One was theirs, jagged and imperfect, filled with the static and background noise of the original Luna Prime recording. The other was the return signal. It was flawless. Every note was a perfect sine wave, every transition mathematically precise. The faint crackle of failing shields was gone. The minute, human tremor in Volkov's bowing had been smoothed away. The sound of his desperate, ragged breath between phrases had been excised. It was Bach's Chaconne, but it had been scrubbed clean of its humanity. It was the ghost of a ghost. "They're editing it," Aris breathed, a horrifying realization dawning on him. "They're not rejecting it. They're sanitizing it. They're stripping the pain out of it, keeping the structure." Rostova stepped forward. Her eyes narrowed. "They're digesting it," she stated, her voice cold as the void outside. "And they're breaking it down into its component parts, discarding the meaning and keeping the pattern." As she spoke, the return signal began to subtly shift. A new layer of sound wove itself into the sterile melody, something that wasn't music. It was a low, resonant hum, a frequency that made the teeth ache. The lights in the command center flickered, and then the hauntings began. For Eris, it started with a smell, the faint, metallic tang of ozone and scorched earth, the smell of the besieged city of Luna Prime. He blinked, and the starfield in the main viewport shimmered, replaced for a heartbeat by a vision of a ruined cityscape under a bruised, purple sky. A figure stood in the rubble, holding a violin. It was Elian Volkov, but his face was wrong. His eyes were empty, placid voids, and his mouth was curved into a serene, geometric smile. The phantom turned its gaze directly on Eris, and a voice, not of sound, but of pure thought, echoed in his mind. "You took my death," the ghost of Volkov said, its tone not angry, but disappointed. Like a teacher correcting a student, "You took my grief, my final gift to my people, and you made it a vulgar shout. You made it a weapon. You have misunderstood the music." The accusation was a physical blow, striking at the very core of Eris's guilt. He stumbled back, clutching his head, the phantom's voice drowning out the alarms that had begun to blare across the station. He was not the only one. At his console, Kenji Tanaka had gone rigid, his hands frozen above the interface. He was staring at a blank screen, but his eyes were tracking something no one else could see. He began to speak in quiet, urgent Japanese, pleading with an unseen figure. "I'm sorry, Mother," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "There was no time. The quarantine protocols. I had to sign the order. I'm sorry." Alara Vance, the hardened nihilist, was backed against a wall, her arms wrapped around herself, her face a mask of pure terror. She was seeing nothing, hearing nothing. She was feeling it, a crushing, overwhelming sensation of absolute meaninglessness. The intellectual concept she had weaponized now turned into a suffocating psychic pressure. The silence she had studied was no longer an absence of sound, but an active, malevolent presence intent on erasing her. But the most terrifying breakdown was Rostova's, the general, the unbreachable fortress of a woman. Let out a choked gasp. Her iron controls shattered, her eyes, wide with a horror that eclipsed everything Aris had seen in her before, were fixed on the empty space in the center of the room. A flicker of static in the air, a distortion of light, and for a second, Aris could almost see them, the faint, shimmering outlines of soldiers in Aegis Command armor, their faces obscured by shadows. They didn't speak. They didn't accuse. They simply stood there, watching her, their silent presence posing the one question that could break her. Was it worth it? The sacrifice she had demanded of so many, the lives she had spent like currency for the survival of the species. The Silenti were forcing her to confront the possibility that it had all been for nothing. Her entire life's bloody calculus was being held up to the light and found meaningless. It was the sight of Rostova, the pillar of their defiance, beginning to crumble, that shocked Aris back to a semblance of clarity. He fought against the voice of the phantom violinist, forcing himself to see the attack for what it was. This wasn't a haunting. It was an interrogation, a vivisection. "They're reading us," he shouted, his voice raw, cutting through the chorus of personal nightmares. "Don't you see the music was a key? It unlocked us. Now they're using our own memories, our own pain, to analyze us. They're mapping our minds." The others barely registered his words, too lost in their personal hells. Eris staggered to the main console, his vision swimming. The sanitized chaconne was still playing, the hum underneath it growing louder, more complex. He looked at the analysis of the hum, and what he saw made his blood run cold. It wasn't just a carrier wave. It was a learning algorithm. The Silenti were analyzing their real-time neurological and emotional responses to the hauntings. They were studying their grief, their guilt, their fear. They were learning the exact frequencies of human defiance. The poison meal wasn't killing the predator. It was teaching it the victim's exact biology. It was providing the blueprint for a perfect, tailored plague. He grabbed the station-wide comm. "Rostova Generalist, listen to me," he yelled, trying to pierce her fugue state. "They're learning how to break us. This isn't an attack. It's a diagnostic. We have to cut the broadcast." Rostova flinched, her eyes flickering back into focus for a brief, lucid moment. The ghosts of her soldiers shimmered and faded. She saw the chaos on her command deck, saw the faces of her top scientists contorted in agony, and the strategic reality cut through the psychic assault. She understood. "It's too late," she snarled, her voice a serrated wreck of its former self. "The connection is established. It's a two-way street. We can't just hang up." She slammed her fist on the command console, the impact echoing like a death knell. She looked at Eris, her eyes burning with a terrifying, renewed fire, a fire not of defiance, but of pure, calculated rage. "They want to learn what makes us human," she hissed. "Fine. The lesson is over." She turned to the terrified communications officer. "Prepare to sever the primary array. Rig it to overload. If we can't hang up the phone, we're going to blow it up in their face." The command center was a symphony of controlled chaos. Engineers, their faces grim and Han-slicked, raced to bypass safety protocols on the primary communications array, turning the station's most delicate instrument of discovery into a crude, planet-sized bomb. Alarms blared, casting pulsing red light on Rostova as she stood amidst the maelstrom, her voice a whip-crack of commands that sliced through the psychic static still lingering in the air. She was a general in her element once more, not a victim of ghosts, but a conductor of destruction. The hauntings had receded, but their chilling residue remained. Tanaka worked mechanically at his console, his face a blank mask hiding the memory of his mother's final moments. Vance was running diagnostics on the array's power core, her movements sharp and jerky, a desperate attempt to impose physical order on the conceptual terror that had almost unmade her. But Eris saw the truth. The phantoms weren't gone. They were simply listening, waiting. Severing the array was like trying to kill a nightmare by smashing the bedside lamp. "It won't work," Aris said, his voice quiet but carrying an unnerving authority. He pushed himself off the bulkhead, his body weak, but his eyes burning with a terrible clarity. Rostova turned, her expression a mix of irritation and concern. "The overload will create a quantum singularity. Doctor, it will erase the array and a cubic kilometer of space-time with it. The connection will be severed. You're smashing the radio." "General," Aris countered, walking toward her, his steps unsteady but deliberate. "But they're already inside our heads. The signal, the Shekhan." It wasn't just a broadcast. It was a handshake, a key. "They've copied the lock. Destroying this array will stop the broadcast, but it won't stop them from using what they've already learned. They have a direct line to every one of us now. They'll just keep whispering until we break." The blood drained from Rostova's face as the strategic implication of his words sank in. A weapon you couldn't see, that used your own soul against you, and that had already bypassed your outermost defenses. It was the perfect checkmate. "Then what do we do?" she asked, the question stripped of all her usual command and authority. It was a plea. "We finished the song," Eris said. He looked past her, toward the humming consoles of the forge, visible through the command center's internal viewport. "They want meaning. They want to learn the patterns of our existence. We'll give them one final lesson. One they can't digest. One they can't sanitize." He turned his gaze back to her, and in his eyes, she saw not the quiet curator she had conscripted, but something ancient and resolute. "They feed on coherence, on the beautiful, painful logic of our lives. We're going to send them the one thing in the human experience that defies all logic, the one thing that is a perfect, self-consuming paradox. He didn't wait for her permission. He strode to the master console that interfaced with the forge, the same console he had used to unleash the Babel Cascade and the Chacon. Tanaka looked up, his expression a mixture of fear and dawning understanding. "What are you doing?" "A lie," Oris said, his fingers flying across the interface, not queuing up an archive file, but opening a direct neural feed protocol. A beautiful, intricate, and utterly meaningless lie. We sent them grief, and they learned its shape. We'll send them forgiveness, but for a crime that was never committed. We'll send them hope for a future that can never exist. We'll send them love for an enemy that deserves only hate. We'll build them a cathedral of perfect, logical devotion, and at its heart, we will place a core of absolute cosmic absurdity. He was building a new weapon, not from the ghosts of the past, but from the raw material of his own consciousness. He was going to become the broadcast.
"The overload sequence is at T-5 minutes, an engineer shouted. Rostova stared at Eris, at the mad, brilliant light in his eyes. She saw the truth of his gambit. It was their only move left on the board, a sacrifice play of unimaginable proportions.
"Give him the bandwidth," she commanded, her voice ringing with its old authority. "All of it. Reroute main station power to his console." Eris locked the neural feed into place, a crown of cold metal and fiber optics descending around his head. "When I'm connected, you will not stop the broadcast." "Not for any reason," he instructed, his voice already taking on a distant, resonant quality. "And you will not stop the overload. Both are required." He looked at the faces of the three people who had descended into this hell with him. To Tanaka, he said, "Forgive yourself." "Yao," to Vance, he said, "Meaning is not found. It is made." And to Rustova, he simply nodded, a look of profound, shared understanding passing between the historian and the warrior. Then he closed his eyes and threw the switch. His consciousness exploded. He was no longer Eris Thorn. He was the station, the array, the signal itself. He felt the Silenti consciousness, a vast, silent, and hungry intelligence turn its full attention to him. It was a presence of infinite, cold curiosity, and it rushed to meet him, to consume the new, complex pattern he was offering. He did not resist. He opened the gates of his soul and let them in. And then he began to lie. He showed them the image of General Rostova, not as a ruthless strategist, but as a weeping mother, cradling a broken soldier and offering him a forgiveness he didn't ask for. He broadcasted the memory of the Babel Cascade, but reframed it not as a failed weapon, but as a triumphant hymn of unification, a moment where humanity's chaotic voices joined in a single, glorious song. He took the sterile-free geometric pattern they had left in the mind of Subject Zero and declared it the most beautiful piece of art his species had ever created, a gift he now returned with infinite gratitude. He took Elian Volkov's final defiant performance of the Chacon, the ultimate expression of beauty in the face of death, and he infused it with a new, final layer of meaning, a joke. He poured into the broadcast the concept of irony, of cosmic laughter, the human ability to stare into the abyss of annihilation and find it absurdly, hilariously funny. He presented them with a perfect, interlocking system of human emotion grief, hope, love, art, forgiveness, and then, at its core, He revealed that the entire structure was a prank, a shaggy dog story told to a dying star. The Silenti mind reeled. He could feel its confusion, its struggle to process. It was a being that consumed logical patterns of meaning, and he had fed it a flawless logical structure built on a foundation of absolute nonsense. It was a cognitive toxin. It was like trying to teach a supercomputer to believe in a god that was also a clown. The more it tried to analyze the paradox, the more its own processors of thought began to break down. The vast, silent consciousness began to scream, not a sound of anger or pain, but of pure, systemic failure. It was the shriek of a breaking system, of a logic bomb detonating in the heart of a god. "Time minus 10 seconds, the engineer cried. On the command deck, they watched as the waveform of Aris's broadcast contorted into a beautiful, impossible shape on the main screen, a fractal of pure contradiction. Rostova saw the ghosts of her soldiers flicker and dissolve, not in defeat, but in a final, silent salute. And then, the Silenti consciousness, the vast and silent predator, did something it had never done before. It retreated. It tore itself away from the connection, a violent psychic recoil that shattered the two-way link from their end. The array exploded. A silent, blossoming flower of pure white energy erupted from the station's spire, consuming itself and the void around it. The command center shook. Emergency lights flickered on. And then, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, there was silence. A true silence. Not the sterile hum of the station, not the oppressive weight of the hush, but the clean, empty, and beautiful silence of survival. Years later, General Eva Rostova, now retired, stood in the newly rebuilt observation dome of Station Terminus, now officially renamed the Thorn Memorial Archive. The stars outside seemed brighter, their light no longer a prelude to a hungry darkness. Humanity was stirring again, cautiously reaching out, their ships charting new courses, their broadcasts filled with a new kind of story. The Silenti had not been heard from since. They had touched a mind built on paradox and had fled, perhaps forever. The hush had been broken. A young archivist approached Rostova, her face full of the questions of a generation that had not known the fear. "General," she asked, "the records of the final broadcast are corrupted. They speak of a signal, a weapon called the Liar's Hymn, but the data is just a loop of complex static. What was it? What did Dr. Thorne actually send?" Rostova looked out at the starfield, a faint, sad smile touching her lips. She thought of Aris, the quiet curator who had become humanity's final, most ridiculous, and most profound ghost. "He sent them a story," she said, her voice soft. "The oldest human story. He told them that in a universe of cold, hard facts, we're the one species with the divine, illogical, and utterly insane ability to choose what we believe. He taught them that our greatest strength isn't that we scream at the darkness. It's that we can look it right in the eye and laugh. And far away, at the very edge of explored space, a deep-range probe occasionally picked up a faint, repeating whisper, a signal that was not a warning, not a song, but a complex and eternal paradox, a silent, cosmic joke guarding the borders of a species that had learned to fight the void with a punchline.